Mark moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, somewhat old-fashioned, but affordable. It had only one odd feature: a heavy wooden door with an iron latch leading to a windowless room. The previous tenant had warned him, no matter what happens, never open that door. Of course, Mark ignored the warning. The first few nights were peaceful, but then he started hearing noises: faint scratching, footsteps, quiet murmuring, as if someone was breathing on the other side. He tried to dismiss it, but the more he ignored it, the louder the sounds became. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, he grabbed a flashlight and decided to open the door. He turned the key, pushed the wood, and the room was empty. No windows, no furniture, just a dust-covered floor. Uneasy, he stepped back, but as he turned, the door slammed shut behind him. Darkness. Absolute darkness. Mark turned and pounded on the door, but no one heard his cries. He felt cold breath on his neck. Spinning around, his flashlight revealed a figure, tall, gaunt, with empty eyes. The entity stared at him without moving. Mark started backing away, but the wall was right behind him. "Help me," it whispered. Mark froze. The figure extended a hand and pointed to the floor. When Mark looked down, he saw words scratched into the dust. "I was here before you." In that moment, he realized that the room had no handles on the inside. The door suddenly began to move. Mark felt something pulling him backward. He screamed, but his voice froze in his throat. The last thing he saw was his own shadow stretching unnaturally before him. And then, silence consumed the room once again. Hours passed. Mark started noticing the room changing. The walls seemed to be closing in. The floor felt sticky, and shadowy handprints began appearing on the walls. The flashlight flickered and then went out completely. Every attempt to open the door was futile. Mark heard voices whispering in his ear, calling his name. Some were crying, others laughing. After hours of desperate searching, Mark collapsed onto the floor. In the darkness, he knew he wasn't alone. Something was moving in the corners of the room. A cold touch slithered across his neck. "Come with me," it whispered again. Suddenly, the door opened. Mark tumbled out onto the apartment floor. When he turned back, the room behind the door was empty once more. The door slowly closed by itself. Mark gasped for breath. As he stood up, he noticed something strange. His shadow didn't move the same way he did for days. He tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. His reflection in the mirror sometimes smiled when he remained serious. Sometimes he heard his own voice even when he wasn't speaking. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered. The nightmare wasn't over. One night, as he lay in bed, a whisper woke him. This time, it wasn't outside him. It was inside. The next day, he disappeared. The police found no trace of him, only an empty apartment and the locked door with the iron latch. A week later, the apartment was rented out to a new tenant. The landlord, while handing over the keys, said only one sentence: "No matter what happens, never open that door." But the story didn't end there. Mark woke up in darkness. But he wasn't in the apartment. He stood in a vast hall illuminated by a dim, bluish light. The walls were covered with old mirrors, yet he saw no reflection, only movement within them. A voice echoed from the shadows. "Now it's your turn." Mark realized the room he had been trapped in was just the beginning. It wasn't just a prison, it was a passage. And now he was on the other side. Opening the door, he hadn't just let something out. He had taken its place forever. Months later, strange things began happening in the apartment. The new tenant, a young woman named Emily, started hearing scratching at the door. She ignored it, but each night the sounds intensified. One evening, when she carefully placed her ear against the wooden door, she heard a whisper, "Don't open it. Please." Emily stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She convinced herself it was her imagination. But the next morning, she found words scratched into the dust on the floor. "I was here before you." Terrified, she hired a paranormal investigator. When the man entered the apartment, he immediately turned pale. "Something is in this apartment," he said. "Something that wants to get out." Emily decided to leave, but before she could pack, the door creaked open on its own, and from the darkness, a shadow emerged, but the shadow wasn't alone, and in the darkness, a familiar whisper echoed, "Now it's your turn."